Good evening, Eugene. How are you?
I'm great, Jana. How are you tonight?
Great, great. Thanks. Tonight, for people who haven't tuned in before, I'll introduce us. I'm Jana London, founder of the Natural Women's Council, and Eugene Garvin does all of the research for the Natural Women's Council and the groups that we work with. And Eugene is a retired director of engineering. So your attention to detail and helping us make sense of the things that don't make sense is of great value. Tonight, we have a very shocking, terrifying are the words that come to mind, presentation for parents to see. And we're going to be discussing the upcoming legislation that the current government are trying to push through, the banning of conversion therapy. And this is really an overreach by the government. And we're going to talk about the bill, but also what it means. And then we're going to connect some dots as to other things that are happening that could lead parents and children down a path where the state has the overreach and has the authority over the parent's child, not the parent. So we encourage everyone to listen to these 15 minutes to be aware. And we will be launching a campaign against this banning of conversion therapy after the general election. So I'll turn it over to you, Eugene, to kick it off.
We're going to be talking about the Prohibition of Conversion Therapy bill. And what we're going to cover, we'll talk about the bill itself, what's in it. It's a very small bill, actually, but very important. Who's pushing it, why it's a bad idea. We'll talk about spend a bit of time on that because that's the main issue. And then we'll talk about some supporting resources and what you can do about it, I guess. So let's get into it. This is the bill. Here it is. It's 2018 bill. It's a private member's bill, but it has been pushed very heavily by one of the government members. Roderic O'Gorman has been pushing this pretty hard. So just because it's a private members bill, don't believe it's not happening, because he was determined to make it happen. So, and we'll see that from the kind of headlines from the news. The mainstream media actually would have headlines on it. Important thing to say, we'll have links to all of these things in the description. So everything we talk about tonight, we're going to have links to it in the description, so people can follow up and look at this stuff yourself, including the articles, the newspaper links, and all that kind of stuff. So this will be the starting point. So here it is. It talks about the definition. So this is the bill itself. The practice or treatment of any person who seeks to change, suppress, eliminate person's sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So this is the important thing. Most people think of this as gay conversion therapy. This has been updated to bring in gender identity and gender expression, and they're the problematic pieces of it. So and there's you can see the definition of gender identity there, which talks about it. We don't need to read it out, and people can see it. So this is what it brings into scope, and this is hugely problematic, as we'll get into. So let's move on to the next part of the bill. It's a very small, actually. It's unlawful to perform conversion therapy on a person, advertise conversion therapy, bring them out of the state, for example, to get conversion therapy, etc. Like there was some of the procedures for gay conversion were pretty horrendous, and I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that, and I don't think we have issues with that. There hasn't been huge evidence for that in Ireland, and we'll see later. There was a study done which is questioned by GenSpect, and there really wasn't a widespread conversion practices in Ireland. So gay conversion really isn't the big issue here. The issue, unfortunately, is gender identity, and that's the problem. So journal.ie covered this last year, and the Minister O'Gorman, pushing hard. They have to do. You see, one of the things I think that has delayed the bill coming through is the complexity around basically subverting parental rights, because the bill basically means you're going to be doing that. Because you're making this therapy, which would be the normal psychological therapy that a parent might want for their child, you're outlawing that. So hence you've now got to take over from the parents and not allow the parents to proceed with that. And I'm sure that's one of the things that's caused the delays in this bill coming through, because that's not straightforward, obviously. So,
And this seems like
so
malpractice, Eugene. If I can just jump in and say, like, if a child presents with gender confusion, whether it's most likely due to the social contagion that's happening now, the rapid onset gender dysphoria, particularly with teenage girls going through puberty, if they go and seek help for that, no more, the same as if they'd seek help if they were, suffering anxiety, depression, an eating disorder, self-harm, whatever the problem is, and they see a therapist, that therapist won't be able to get to the root cause and help them and support them. They just have to affirm them down the gender affirmation path, which pushes them into the social transition and then the puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries, irreversible practices. And I saw on a couple slides back, Eugene, it identified a professional as a counselor or an educator. So this means that
Yes.
in school, for example, you could have Liam or Lucy, I'll use those names from the INTO video, who present to the teacher as, maybe they're being taught this transgenderism in school, and they say, gosh, I'm a tomboy, maybe I'm in the wrong body. And the teacher cannot help them understand why they feel the way. They just have to affirm them, or they could be
Yeah.
uh,
Correct.
criminalized.
Like, let's be honest about what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that's come from feminist theory. It came from feminist theory, right? That's been adopted in our society as if it's a scientific reality and a a reality of anthropological reality, which it isn't. And now we're going to actually criminalize people who would attempt to, help out a child who's suffering from confusion. There always has been gender dysphoria has existed for whatever, as long as we've ever known, at a very low level.
Mm.
And there's always been treatment for it. And we know historically that 80% of kids, when they get through puberty, it resolves itself. And most of them end up being gay. And there's a very small number that may go ahead with, continuing on and going through a full medicalization. That's the history. But right now it's gone through the roof because we're seeing huge increases in numbers, and it's been driven by the culture. Obviously, it's been driven into schools, into society, into everything. And now
So
we're
it's
going to
pushing it's
create this
pushing
league.
children down. It's pushing them down an irreversible medical path for something that
Yeah,
80% are just going to grow out of anyway, be happy in their skin once they go through puberty, and whether they turn out straight or gay, that's another point,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it's
That's
putting them
another
down
point.
an irreversible, dangerous path.
Yeah, putting a legal framework, a kind of a legal shackle, as it were, handcuffs on
Mhm,
the parents,
mhm.
preventing the proper therapeutic approach. So that's a huge issue. So where is this coming from? This is the question. So this book, or this document, the Denton's document, as some people may know it, and some people in the know will have seen this document before. So it has strategies for trans rights, right? And one of the strategies, you can see it here, the right to development of the child. And it talks about, for example, states should take action against parents who are obstructing the free development of a young trans person's identity in refusing to give parental authorization when required. That's basically you take over the role of parents. You subvert the parent's role, and you affirm the child, and you medicalize the child regardless of what the parents want to do. That's basically what that's calling for, legislation to allow you to do that. So this is problematic, right? So that's the Denton's document. Belong to or welcoming this?
Of course they
I'm
are.
sure.
They're celebrating all of these confused children coming out as trans kids during their Belong To Indoctrination Week. Of course, Belong To, who gets so much government funding from our public funds, want to confuse and
Yeah.
indoctrinate children.
And I'm sure they had input into the bill as well. Um, ILGA. So ILGA is International Lesbian Gay Association, which has kind of been expanded to lesbian, gay, bisexual, etc., transgender. Um, And the reason I'm putting them up here is because a number of Irish politicians took a pledge with these people. Now you can see that they've got their own toolbox to combat so-called conversion therapy. So they're again advocates for banning conversion therapy on the basis of gender identity. They would be on that page, right? So they did have a pledge. And this was the pledge here where you can sign here. Do you see it there at the bottom? A little tick box,
Mhm.
right? And what you're committing to do with this pledge is put the safety of the community, as in the LGBTQ plus community, above all other concerns, and always follow the do no harm principle, which is kind of a contradiction in this context when we talk about
Sure
conversion
is.
therapy for gender identity, including keeping my work out of the public eye wherever necessary. So we had a whole load of Irish politicians sign up to this thing.
Maria Walsh just tweeted earlier this week that she was happy to meet Dr. Karen Carr from AbbVie to discuss women's health, specifically migraines. So, AbbVie, who make puberty blockers, we're meeting with Maria Walsh, and it's also no coincidence that Minister for Justice Helen McEntee's husband is a director at AbbVie who make the puberty blockers, and she's the one pushing through the hate crime bill, putting in those 72 genders to silence people like us from speaking about this. I'm sure she'll support banning the conversion therapy because she wants these Irish children to be pushed down the trans path.
ILGA Europe, I just, out of curiosity, I did a quick check, and they're obviously into the whole area of hate crime and hate speech as well, and pushing for governments to do legislation on these. So no surprise there, right? That we're seeing this kind of two-tier legislation being introduced. So here we go. So this is where it becomes problematic. So this is from Scotland. Parents who refuse children gender change face 7 years in jail under the potential new legislation in Scotland. So most people, when I mention this to them, they say, oh yeah, conversion therapy, that's a terrible thing. We should ban that. That's fine. No issue there, no problem. They don't see that when you bring gender identity into it, it gets really complicated. And this is one of the issues that parents basically get taken out of the picture. And this isn't different. Like we'll have other links to this. It's the same in other countries. The same sort of legislation. We had it from Australia, right? In our Parents Unplugged. So these are some of the comorbidities or underlying causes of gender confusion, and there's many of them. Many of them. Now, the big ones are things like autism spectrum disorder, or the children actually being gay, same-sex attracted, being gay, and there's other mental health issues. And one of the issues is obviously abuse. That can be an issue, right? And that abuse could be happening from a parent or a relative or somebody else. And just think of the use case where a child is being abused, and one of the reactions to abuse is to declare that you want to be a different gender. If it's a girl being abused, for example, she might say, I want to be a boy because I won't be abused. If I'm a boy, I won't be abused, right? That kind of thing. But then that gets picked up on, and you cannot go through any psychotherapy then to determine that that child was abused. You won't be allowed to do that, because if you did that, you'd be potentially doing conversion therapy on that child. It's
Yeah,
outrageous.
and you could have a child on here on this circle here. You can see, for example, depression, anxiety, and difficulty fitting in. That is something that many children during puberty are going to feel a bit anxious. Their bodies change. They don't fit in. They're not, little girls aged 12, 13 dealing with menstrual cycles. It's not fun. Let's face it. It is not fun going through puberty, but it's a natural thing that every child should be allowed to go through. And if you don't treat the child for these underlying conditions like depression or anxiety, they could end up self-harming. They could end up in an even worse
Yeah.
situation with their mental health if that expert or educator, it's stated, or counselor can't treat the underlying comorbidity. They just have to affirm they're in the wrong body. They get pushed down a dangerous, irreversible path that will change them for the rest of their lives.
The 6 different points here related to parents and the involvement of parents in a child taking on a trans identity. You can have queer neo-communist parents who very much bought into this thing, and they wait until the child is old enough before the child declares what gender they are, for example. There's homophobic parents who don't want a gay child for whatever reason. It could be religious reasons, it could be other reasons in the family or something. And so it's better having a trans kid than having a gay kid. And they would then look to encourage the transitioning of their child from a very young age, perhaps dress them up, in clothes and makeup or whatever it is to bring them down that line. And the next one is kind of along similar lines, I guess, but this whole notion, because it's a kind of a badge of honor, social cachet, I'm a very progressive person and I want to show that I'm progressive. So I need to have a trans child. If you notice all of the Hollywood stars, some of them have adopted kids and they're all trans. Like, where did that
Yeah.
come from? And then Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This is a mental health issue for the mother, and it transposes itself onto the child. In usually with other conditions, but a trans identity is another path for that potentially that affects the child really seriously. And then you wanted a boy rather than a girl, so perhaps the parents might kind of, in their manners and the way they talk with the child, and this gets through to the child, and the child kind of internalizes this fact that I'm not wanted as a boy, or I'm not wanted as a girl, and that causes them then to come out as trans. And then the last
Mhm,
one is abuse, which we talked about, and that's
mhm,
kind of serious because that does happen. And one of the concerns here is with this new legislation, you will now have no means of determining that that abuse took place because you're going to
yeah,
basically outlaw that. We've used these slides, I think, in some other presentations, but this is just the ideological view versus the clinical pathological view of gender dysphoria. Dr. Donald O'Shea, Paul Moran would be in the kind of clinical viewpoint, the developmental view on this, that you do that talk therapy, you determine the underlying causes potentially, and you get the right answers. Because the other problem, and that if you don't get to those other comorbidities, they end up being untreated. So
mhm,
the fact that this child may have clinical depression, and you just affirm them in their trans identity, and you don't treat the clinical depression that they have, that poor child, suicidality, all these risks are still there because you're not treating the root cause. This is the issue.
mhm,
It's
yep.
outrageous. You cannot do this. Like, this bill is outrageous. It really is. It's so harmful to children. It's so harmful to parents.
I'll call it out to Minister Roderic O'Gorman pushing this through the same way I called out Minister Norma Foley regarding those inappropriate books. This is state sponsored child abuse. This is not helping distressed children. So the material's getting pushed on them to convince them they're in the wrong body. So they go down a confused path, and then they can't get the help for why they're confused. They just have to be pushed down an irreversible path. So Minister Roderic O'Gorman, this is state sponsored child abuse.
It is. It is. Because he's on the right hand side of this chart right now, along with
Yep.
everybody else in the government. Pretty well everybody else in the Dáil is on the right hand side of this thing. This is going to come back to haunt us as one of the biggest child abuse scandals in the history of the world. Of course, it will do. Just done
Absolutely.
because people wanted to go with an ideological point of view that they have. So let's move on. The next one goes through this in a bit more detail, and I guess the important thing here is that, parents, on the left hand side of this chart is the way you should do it. You follow the steps, and it's the path of least harm. You look at all the comorbidities, you treat them. If the child has other things like depression or whatever, you deal with that. If they were abused, you deal with that, and you get them through puberty. And we know that 80% plus of them will be fine after that. And then there's a percentage you'll probably have to keep an eye on. Some of those will still, they'll be gay eventually, and they'll come to terms with that, and they'll be good with that. So it's the path of least risk. But the right hand side here is the path that they're pushing right now aggressively, as we can see.
And Eugene on
So
the left would be the
yeah.
on the left approach. That would be something supported from what I've read on the GenSpect website for anyone who
Oh yeah.
has a child who's
Yeah.
suffering
100%.
confusion
Yeah.
based on the
100%.
social contagion. GenSpect, but also the CAS report. Anyone who hasn't read that, you can look up the CAS report. That came out of, over the I think in April that was published.
Yeah, and as I said, the other thing it does tackle is the fact that the comorbidities will get treated properly if you follow the path on the left. If you follow the path on the right, you will not be treating the comorbidities, and the suicidality of those children due to those comorbidities will still exist because you're not dealing with it. The affirmation is not going to solve the problem. That's the issue. So let's move on. So uh, this is just a recent study on desistance data. This one wasn't based on puberty; it was based on length of time, and it's basically saying that within 5 years of a child indicating, that there were, the gender distress, gender confusion, 5 years from the point at which that was diagnosed, 2/3 of them had desisted, basically. Um, Now, we can't see the relationship versus puberty. I haven't gone through the details. So puberty is obviously is a critical milestone, as we know, in terms of desistance, and coming through the other end of puberty. So, but again, this tells you like two 2/3 are going to desist within 5 years if you do nothing. And you could have medicalized these. You could have brought them down to social transition and then put them on puberty blockers when they would have desisted anyway. So not good. Then here we go. I mean, this is something I think. Jenna, you called out this National Education Psychological Service and the additional recruitment, I guess, that's been coming into this. Do you want to talk about this for a few minutes? I guess you were looking into it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a red flag, and it's been a red flag. I tweeted on it nearly, I think, about 9 months ago. I just retweeted it tonight. I dug it up, connecting the dots that we have the banning of the conversion therapy bill, and then looking back a year ago, Minister for Education Norma Foley was talking about the National Educational Psychological Service (NEPS) and how she's investing all of these millions and millions of public funds into this program to get therapists into schools for all of the stressed and anxious children to promote their well-being. It all sounds good on paper. We know that all of those draconian COVID measures in school with, putting masks on kids and sanitizing them and telling them to keep the distance and putting fear in them, absolutely that put mental health on the floor. But when you look at what's happening with the banned conversion therapy bill and you look at this, I'll just go to the next slide. She's offering, the pilot scheme, for example, to offer free counseling in primary schools across 7 counties. That was in May of 2023. And then October, just gone about a month ago, she's extending counseling to 61 urban schools. So all about getting these counselors and these psychologists in schools. But then you look at the comment that she made, which was from an article that I'm going to put up here now. It came out in extra.ie. It was from the 5th of July, 2023. And it's titled Fears Children Could Be Forced into Trans Classes. And Norma Foley quoted here, in cases of students who do not attend classes where the new curriculum is being taught, Ms. Foley said, if a school has concerns about a student, the school may request the involvement of a NEPS psychologist. That was linked to children opting out of this SPHE and transgenderism. So if you opt your children out of this program, Norma Foley stated here that if there's concerns, they could go to a psychologist. So they go to the psychologist, counselor in the school that she's investing all this money in, and they cannot treat through any therapy or engaging the parents about what is really wrong with the child. They have to go through the affirmative path of the gender dysphoric child. So Johnny goes in and says, he just came from a lesson, and the lesson is pushing transgenderism in the classroom. So he goes to the counselor and says, hey, counselor, I think I'm in the wrong body. Counselor has to say yes and affirm. Boom, he's led down a social transition at school, puberty blockers, hormones. The parents are sitting out there working their job or sitting at home, not knowing this is happening in school. If this doesn't terrify any parent, and if anybody doesn't agree that this is an overreach, that would be astonishing. This is a serious overreach. So in our opt-out letter last year, we had seen this come out. And when we did the opt-out letter, we had a point in the letter that opts children out of being seen by a school counselor, therapist, or psychologist, because we had a suspicion then that they could be affirmed and transitioned at school. And now the banning of the conversion therapy bill, that really confirms the suspicions that we had. So it's really, really quite astonishing that this is where Minister Foley is pushing it in the classrooms. She's already breached our trust with the inappropriate content in schools, despite thousands pushing back. This is another overreach and breach of trust by Minister Norma Foley to put children down the psychological NEPS path if they opt out, and then they have to be gender confusion has to be affirmed. So it's just outrageous.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a huge concern, Jana. So let's look at the consequences, I guess, if this were adopted. And we've kind of talked about most of them, but it's making it illegal to engage in talk therapy, basically, and all that goes with that for a child that, say, may have multiple other comorbidities, and most of them do. Most of the studies indicate that there's at least one other comorbidity for children that have gender confusion. They'll be affirmed, and you won't get to the root cause. And as I say, it could lead to hiding an abuse situation that was leading to the gender confusion that won't get determined. It obviously undermines the rights of parents because it takes it out of their hands. You have to affirm and go down that path. And it's just going to basically mandate the current policy that government, HSC, Department of Education, that they all have. It's just basically enshrining that into law now. So it's mandated. So let's kind of move on. I mean, so you can get some other information, if you look at some of what's happening in other jurisdictions, the UK here, our good friends Safe Schools Alliance, they talk about it, so they make some good points. We'll have a link to this in the description. GenSpect, we talked about. There was a study done for the minister from Trinity College talking about gender identity conversion therapy. And GenSpect kind of do a bit of a debunking on that. They kind of go through it in detail. They've got a document there, which you can download. Again, we'll have a link to that. So they do a full critique of that. And then there's this memorandum of understanding on conversion therapy, which is kind of scary when you look at it. Where you've got these three organizations, the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland, the Irish Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, and the Psychological Society of Ireland, kind of signing this memorandum of understanding on this, buying into this, right? So again, there's a good write-up done by GenSpect on this, so you can have a good read of that. It's on their website. Again, we'll have the links to this stuff. Sex Matters, they produced this booklet basically saying why ban talk therapy. They even had an article here talking about telling children they can change sex is actually conversion therapy. They're turning it around. They're saying that by teaching this stuff in school, by engaging conversion, giving puberty blockers to kids before they get to puberty, you're engaging in the conversion therapy. That puberty should be a human right to go through puberty. And all the physical and emotional changes that come with that you're entitled to that. So it's kind of an interesting, again, article you can have a read of. We'll have the link to that. And this is another website, which I do, they're a great website. They publish a lot of the kind of more academic material, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. And again, they talk about conflating ethical psychotherapy with conversion therapy, which is what's happening here. And the fact that one size doesn't fit all. Like every single child is unique. They'll have unique things that determine why they're expressing gender confusion. And one size fits all is not the answer, unfortunately. So, what to do? We're basically saying you cannot vote for a candidate who's into this because this will come in. Like it's interesting that it doesn't appear in certainly any of the manifestos I looked at. It's not in the Green Manifesto, for example. I wonder why that's the case because Roderic O'Gorman is committed to this. Absolutely committed. If he's re-elected, if he's in a government position, he'll be pushing hard on this. And how many other government politicians have made pledges, for example, to belong to or to ILGA or to some other group?
The entire
Yeah, they're all
doll,
into it.
Erin, right now is infested with politicians who are pushing the transgender ideology onto our children in school, and they will be pushing this banning of the conversion therapy. They need to all be voted out, or children in Ireland will be harmed, irreversible harm. The birth rates are at an all-time low. That came out today in the news. Birth rates are
Yeah.
down, death rates are up. Giving kids puberty blockers isn't going to help the birth rate here in Ireland.
Any politician that comes to the door, even if they're not the main parties, if they're an independent or some other party, you need to ask them their position on this. Yeah.
It is terrifying and would make any parent anxious, but we will be launching a campaign. We will be lobbying the new TDs, the new senators. We will lobby, but we really need pressure with this one because this will be the biggest child abuse scandal this country's ever seen.
Yeah, easily. So I think people should share. We'll have a lot of links in the description. Share this video or share the links, whatever you want to do. Educate yourself maybe a little bit more. If you're new to this is probably really shocking you. You're probably wondering how is this even possible? Like you might be asking that question. So we'd ask you to inform yourself, share the message because most people don't. Nobody's talking about this bill at the moment. It's not on the election forum. You won't hear anybody talking about it on RTE or any of these places.
There's a reason that Roderic
Yeah,
O'Gorman, who's sponsoring it, didn't put it on his Green Manifesto because nobody would vote. Not,
yeah.
I'm sure there's enough other reasons not to vote for him, but this would really be quite damning.
We did have the session with Australia with Rachel Reid, where she talked about the experience in Australia, where basically Child Protection Services came in and took over the child. Parents never saw the child afterwards. That's happening in California, and potentially it could happen elsewhere because you can't, the parents are taken out of the equation. The decision is being made that you have to affirm. That's basically it.
The whole government approach with this banning of the conversion therapy aligns with all of the other things we talked about in our
Yeah.
podcast. Anyone can look up the subversion of parental rights, and it's, the government bought the books. These SPHE books that are inappropriate do not come home because there's no homework for them. The government's feeding lunch to the children. I did a podcast that I've seen the ingredients, I've seen the samples. Those government hot lunches are not healthy for children. And now the government wants to push your children down an affirmation path. So there is a clear subversion of parental rights, and any parent, regardless of where they sit with everything else, should not want the government to have an overreach with their children.
Yeah. So it's a neo-communist policy where basically the family, ultimately you don't want family, you don't want the notion of family, and that the state take over control of the children. That's a kind of a neo-communist policy. That's what's been implemented. We've seen it. They wanted to make changes in the referendum, take women out of the equation, degrade what it meant to have a family, basically so that it was meaningless. So
We
you can
saw
see the
the
directions that
anti-Irish
they're going.
book that everybody kicked
The
off
anti-Irish
about.
book,
That's
yeah,
been retracted,
yeah,
making
yeah,
light and
yeah,
ridiculing the traditional Irish family. So we can clearly see what's happening. The writing's on the wall. Anyone who hasn't seen it hasn't taken time to open the book, but it's really time for people
yeah,
to start opening the book, start opening your eyes and realize what is happening to children in schools. And what's happening now with this curriculum is state-sponsored child abuse. The banning of the conversion therapy bill will be even worse. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This is a great place to say good night or good morning, depending on when you're listening, and keep your eyes open for the next podcast on the primary school curriculum because they are going after the 5-year-olds next. And have a good night.